Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. I've got 4 books here, but I actually only read one of them this week, so the others I'm just going to dispense with fairly quickly. The Witches by Roald Dahl. I didn't read any of this past week, although I did finally get around to finishing my review of this. So I reviewed this earlier in the week. Now I've finished it, I've reviewed it, I'm done with it, so this one is off of my weekly reading rotation, off of my currently reading rotation. The other book that's coming off of my currently reading rotation is the Brothers Grimm. I finished this a couple weeks ago, but it took me a while to write out all my thoughts on the weblog, and then I filmed the video. So I'm also done with this one now. I've read it, I've finished it, I've reviewed it. I did my best on the review. It's I don't know. I do feel a little bit on that review that I talked for 40 minutes and said very little of substance. Actually, a lot of my reviews are like that. Um, but it's there's a lot more to be said if you were to get into the individual stories and talk about the interesting things about individual stories. But in terms of just talking about the reading experience in general, what it was like to start at page 1 and try and plow your way through all these stories, I did my best to talk about that. But at any rate, this one's done. I've read it, I reviewed it, it's coming off of my currently reading list. This one, sorry to say, I did not read this week, which makes 2 weeks in a row that I've not made any progress on this book. I'm doing really badly on it. I'm going to try and get some pages read for next week. It's been a busy week for me in terms of working, teaching, preparing for the classes, marking. It's just one of those weeks where it's all kind of come down. Not to mention being a parent and looking after the toddler and stuff like that. So I just did not feel like I had a lot of time or energy to devote to extra reading for professional development because let's face it, it's not pleasure reading. And yes, and again, I still have some sentence trees, which I need to get rid of. Part of the reason I've stalled out on this is because I'm stuck on the exercises at the end of the chapter, which I do want to do, but just need to find time to spread out some paper on a table and try and get some peace and quiet to do that. I did actually use this book briefly this week. Somebody was asking about it on Twitter. Sorry, not asking about this specific book, but on the Twitter, if you follow other English language teachers, which I try and do, sometimes grammar questions will come up, and somebody wanted to know why you had to separate phrasal verbs when there was a pronoun. And this is something that comes up in a lot of grammar books. So, for example, turn the light off is okay, but you can't say turn off it. If it's a pronoun, you have to separate the phrasal verb, turn it off, and put that in between. And most grammar books, especially most pedagogical grammar books, simply say, this is the rule. And somebody was asking, is there a reason why there is that rule? And so I was able to reference this book in a reply to that on Twitter, trying to say this book actually does make an attempt to say why that's a rule. The part of the book which is relevant is part of the book I haven't even read yet, chapter 22 on phrasal verbs. But I was using this book as a reference when I was preparing a lesson on phrasal verbs earlier, so I had skipped ahead to that part. And they do make they make an effort to give the pragmatic reason why pronouns are inserted into the middle of phrasal verbs when phrasal verbs are separated. So I did reference this book in a conversation on Twitter even though I didn't read any of it this week. But all of my pages from this week, all of my page numbers, come from Herodotus, which I finally started this week. It's been sitting on my shelves for 3 years, and then for even longer than that, it's been on my to-be-read list. As there quite often is with a classic book, there's a lot of introduction. There's a translator's preface done by Tom Holland himself, the translator. And then there's another introduction by, what's the guy's name? What is his name? Paul Cartledge. Paul Cartledge, who I've never heard of before, but apparently is, according to the book cover, is a well-known scholar. So essentially 2 introductions, and then notes on measurements and currency, which I read through, and summary of the contents, which I read through, translator's note on the text, which I read through. So 38 pages of introduction, which I'm counting towards my weekly page total. And then 72 pages of main text. So 110 pages this week from Herodotus, the only book I made any progress with this week. Right. So I made a video earlier this week when I talked about why I was starting this video, as is my habit. But to recap that briefly, this is a book that I've been meaning to read for years, or has been on my radar for years. I've been interested in ancient history since I was a boy, so in that sense I've been aware of it. But I've been, I don't know, for the past 10 years or so, I've been thinking to myself, okay, I've got to get around to reading this one of these days. And so because of that, because I've been curious about this book for so long before I've picked it up, you know how this goes. I've watched a lot of YouTube videos on it. I've read Wikipedia about it. I've just done a lot of nibbling around the edges, so to speak, of this book long before I picked it up. So I'm somewhat familiar, I guess, with the basic premise of the book, even though this is my first time attempting to read through it. So for a lot of these stories, at least the ones I was reading this week, I constantly had this feeling of like, I've heard this before. Where have I heard this before? And was it this YouTube video, or was it that YouTube video? I've watched so many YouTube videos on ancient history over the years, so definitely some of the stories in here I definitely felt like I picked up on YouTube before now. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Why don't I start with the translator's preface? And this again is something I had some exposure to on YouTube, because a few years ago I watched a speech that Tom Holland gave, Tom Holland being the translator, on YouTube, in which he talked about the same things that are in his translator's preface. He talks about, as a young boy, being really excited by hearing the stories about the Greek-Persian wars, the 300 Spartans and the Battle of Thermopylae and all the famous stuff, and being really interested in this as a boy, and then tracking down Herodotus when he was 12 years old and what it was like reading Herodotus. I've got to say, I feel somewhat guilty for only now, at this late stage in my life, getting around to Herodotus, because I think I definitely knew about Herodotus at 12 years old. It crossed my mind that it might be interesting reading, but I just never picked it up, as is the case with many books I should have read years ago. So hearing about how Tom Holland had read this at 12, With actually not only Tom Holland. I know people I was friends with in college or something like that who also read Herodotus when they were adolescents. So yeah, I feel guilty about just getting around to it now in midlife. But that aside from Tom Holland talking about how these stories fascinated him when he was 12, he talks about how the other thing that frustrated him is he had come into this book wanting the big battles between the Greeks and the Persians and the grand epic. And then instead he found that Herodotus's narrative just meanders all over the place. He'll start telling a story and then he'll get distracted and tell another tangential story, or he'll go off for several pages on ethnography, talking about the customs of different peoples. Um, and again, I this is stuff that I've heard from other people who've read Herodotus, not only Tom Holland. But Tom Holland mentioned how much that used to frustrate him as a 12-year-old boy when he just wanted to get to the action. But he says now that he's an adult and has reread Herodotus many times, he finds all the digressions and all the extra factoids are what makes this book such fun to read. Um, and that, again, I had heard this before from his talk on YouTube and other places, but I think it helps a lot to know what you're getting into. And that definitely seems, I'm only 72 pages into it, but that definitely seems what I'm getting into. A lot of digressions and a failure to write a linear narrative. Tom Holland makes a couple different comparisons. He compares it to Tristram Shandy, which is a book I did years ago as an abridged audiobook. But it's a famous book. When did it come out? 16th century or something like that. Or 17th century. It's a famous old English book, which the running joke is it's about a narrator who cannot get to the point of his story. He keeps trying to tell a story and then he gets distracted by something else, and that's the running joke throughout Tristram Shandy. And Tom Holland says Herodotus was doing the same thing. He also compares it to a shaggy dog story. Shaggy dog, I believe, is one of those really long jokes. When I was in grade school, we used to call it the purple feathers joke. I'm sure this goes by different names in different regions, but it's about a really long joke, and then you're telling this joke to your friends one night around the campfire or something like that, and the joke just goes on and on and on and on, and then the punchline is at the end. There is no punchline, or there's something else that comes in. The story completely doesn't end up where you think it's going to end up. Sorry, I'm really killing this explanation, aren't I? Hopefully you know what I mean when I say a shaggy dog story. It says Herodotus was essentially doing one of those. He says it's like the first shaggy dog story. I am so far, I've started book one, and I haven't even finished book one. There are 9 books in here, although it does say as part of the translator's preface that the book divisions are later. Herodotus didn't separate this into books. That was later scholars who did it. But anyways, 9 books. I'm still stuck in book one. How many pages is book one? Looks like it's about 100 pages. So I'm 72 pages in. Yeah, book one is 106 pages. So, keep in mind that I'm only just beginning this story, but so far it does appear to be very much what Tom Holland warned me it would be like, to the point where before I was sitting down and filming this video, I was thinking to myself, okay, what did I read this week? It's very hard to summarize it because it's a little bit hard to remember all the different tangents and digressions that go through the pages. I mean, I can talk about some things, but I'm not sure I could remember all the different plot threads that Herodotus takes you on, or the plot digressions. Sorry, actually, let me back up yet again to mention another thing about reading this book. You might notice I've got two bookmarks here. One bookmark for the text and one bookmark for the endnotes, because, yeah, it's one of those books. There are a lot of endnotes. Looks like they're all by the translator, Tom Holland. And they really come thick and fast. I mean, right within the first paragraph, just this little bit here, we've got 4 different footnotes. So I'm like, okay. Okay, and then you go back, and before you even get to the end of that same sentence, then you've got to go back and find your place again. Sorry, this camera is too high up. It's not showing me looking through the book, looking for the footnotes, but that's what I was trying to pantomime just then. So yeah, I mean, 4 endnotes. I'm trying to remember to call them endnotes because it requires you to go to the back of the book. I think a footnote is usually at the bottom of the page, and an endnote is in the back. And these are definitely endnotes, sends you all the way to the back. And to complicate it further, there's a lot of stuff in the back. There's all the notes, and then there are all the maps, and then there's the map index, and the acknowledgments, and the glossary index. I mean, it's all useful stuff, so I'm glad it's in there, but it's not just a matter of flipping to the back and finding the endnotes. You need to flip to the back and then find the endnotes in between everything else. So, very early on, I realized I was going to need 2 bookmarks if I was going to read this book. I wish that they had done these notes as footnotes, so you could stay right on the same page without going to the back. But it seems like, for better or for worse, not many people do bottom of the page notes anymore, huh? It seems like they always are sending you to the back of the book. I guess maybe the reason for that is people who don't want to be bothered with the notes can just ignore them. But I always go and check it. The notes at the back vary in terms of informational content. Sometimes there'll be what I think is really valuable extra information to help you understand the history you're reading. And sometimes they're just essentially Tom Holland saying, "Oh, isn't this interesting?" Or Tom Holland saying, "This section is supposed to be humorous," or it's sometimes they're just little throwaway comments. And then I think, geez, you sent me all the way to the back just for that. You interrupted my reading flow just for that. At least that's what I was thinking at first. The more I chug along with this, the more I'm beginning to realize that following all those end notes and reading this edition is like having a friend comment on the book over your shoulder, or a teacher, a friend or a teacher. Is essentially the role Tom Holland has given himself with all these footnotes, end notes. So if you get into that vibe, then I guess it can be kind of interesting to to see what Tom Holland's 2 cents on every paragraph is. But yeah, it involves a lot of flipping to the back, and then the maps. Now, I mentioned in my started video, the maps are here at the back. I mentioned in my started video that apparently something I've been reading on the internet and Amazon reviews. Apparently, the landmark edition of Herodotus is really helpful because the maps are integrated with the text. But for better or for worse, that's not the edition I've got. This is not the landmark edition. This is Tom Holland's translation. Tom Holland, I think, is a really good writer. So I'm happy he's translating this. He translates it in a colloquial style, but so much the better as far as I'm concerned. But I would have liked maybe the maps to be integrated more. Although I think I saw the landmark edition of Thucydides in a bookstore once and was flipping through it. And it's definitely not the case. My impression was, even then, it's definitely not the case that you have maps on every page. So even with the landmark edition, it probably wouldn't have enough maps. But you've got all these cities being mentioned, and sometimes you're able to just keep reading without a clear idea of the geography. But sometimes you really want to say, okay, now where is this? Where are we talking about? I was struggling with the maps at first, but then I found this helpful map index after the maps. So when there's a city mentioned, you go to the map index, you find out which of the 10 maps is going to be on, and then that will help you find it usually. There are always some cities you can't manage to find on the map. Certainly that was my experience here. So I'm making this sound like an onerous reading experience, probably, talking about all the flipping back and forth I'm having to do just to make any headway on here. And certainly it is slow going. And it's a difficult book to eat while you're reading, which unfortunately for me is where a lot of my reading takes place, at the dinner table nowadays. So you're trying to eat spaghetti and at the same time keep track of your place while flipping back to the end note at the end. Not ideal. But all that being said, the content of the book, the actual story, I am finding really interesting. You do have to go back sometimes and be like, okay, who was that guy again? Which king was he? Who was he the son of? There's a little bit of that, but aside from that, it's really interesting. So what have I read so far? So it starts off in book one, and he says, right, I'm going to try and explain why there was this clash between East and West, in his view, the clash of civilizations. And then he tells a bunch of stories about how the West, in his view, in Herodotus's view, seems to originate with Asia Minor, I guess, what modern day Turkey. It seems to be his definition. So this is like the old school version of East. He tells a story, first of all, about different women being abducted back and forth. And the names are names that are familiar from Greek mythology. Io, spelled I-O, from Argo. Europa, Medea from Colchis. And of course, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you're recognizing these names. But he actually doesn't give the mythological stories. He gives a somewhat different version of these women being abducted. First, the Easterners had abducted the Greek woman, and then the Greeks abducted the Eastern women. This is actually a point. I hate to say I want more end notes, but this is actually a point where I would have appreciated some more explanation about how exactly this was related to the Greek myths, because it seems like he's taking the Greek myths, but he's just telling a demythologized version of them. And then we get to the Trojan War. which he summarizes in a few paragraphs, and he puts that in the context of the tendency at the time to abduct different women. Um, and so, of course, Helen was abducted, and that started the big war of East versus West, which he doesn't get into. And fair enough. That is well attested to, or well told in other Greek sources. I think he only devotes 3 paragraphs to it, and most of that time debating whether or not the Greeks overreacted. Um, and then he comes to Croesus, I think is how the name was pronounced, a Lydian. So talking about the Lydian Empire, and the Lydian Empire was apparently in modern day Turkey. But then he goes back and he gives the whole history of the dynasty that Croesus was a part of. And this actually, this story and all the subsequent stories um, seem to be more folk tales than they are actual history, or more mythology than history, which again is something I knew before I started this book, because Herodotus has a reputation. And they are interesting folk tales. They're fun to read. I guess there's a potential maybe to get frustrated by this book, and I think some readers have been frustrated by this book. If you're looking for a straight history, you're going to be frustrated by all the stuff in here that is obviously folk tales, obviously mythological. And if you're looking for a straight myth, then maybe you're going to be frustrated by all the boring history in here. But if you're looking for a combination of history and myth, then that appears to be what this book is. So we start off right away with what is obviously a folk tale. There's the king, and I'm going to butcher all these Greek names. Sorry, Candalis, who has a bodyguard, Giges. Sorry, a king and his bodyguard. I won't bother trying to pronounce the names. And the king says to his bodyguard, he says, "My wife is so beautiful." And the bodyguard says, "Oh yeah, I'm sure she is." And the king says, "I know you're agreeing with me just to be polite, but you don't really appreciate exactly how beautiful she is." He says, "You have to see her when she's naked." And the bodyguard says, "No, of course I can't do that. That would be scandalous." And the king says, "No, I order you. And besides which, it's all going to be perfectly safe. You're going to see her behind a screen. You hide behind the screen in my room. And when the wife comes in, she's going to take off her clothes before she comes to bed, and she won't even know you're there." So they do it, but the wife actually does see him, the bodyguard. But the wife doesn't say anything at the time. But then later the wife confronts the bodyguard, and she says, "I know you saw me naked. I can't stand this affront to my dignity. Either you have to agree to kill my husband, the king, or I'm going to kill you." Now, what power she has over the bodyguard is not exactly spelled out here, because she doesn't say, "I'm going to have you killed." She says, how does she put it exactly? I was reading this, and I thought to myself, well, what is he afraid of the queen for? I mean, she's just the queen, and he's a bodyguard. Presumably, he's stronger than her. But she is threatening to kill him. But then Tom Holland says later in his notes, he says something like, the role reversal of man and woman here is something that pops up a couple other times in Herodotus's writings, or something to that effect. Where is it? Oh yeah. So the unnamed queen is by no means the last hugely resourceful woman to reverse gender expectations and dominate the opposite sex in the pages of Herodotus. I'm out of time. I'm going to have to stop this video here. So I'll see you next week with another weekly reading vlog and talk about what I've been reading in Herodotus for that week. Sorry for the abrupt ending.